All right, ladies and gentlemen, looks like I got everything set up here, so we are good to go. This is our lecture on the developments in Europe. So we have already seen developments in China, in India, in the Islamic world, and in the Americas. It's time to hop back over the Atlantic Ocean to Europe. What we're going to see today is we're going to see a society that is massively different than the ones that we have already studied, especially in terms of centralization in government, but also in culture. I mean, when we looked at Eastern ideology, I've said and alluded to at least a few times that this is drastically different than Western ideology. Well, today we're going to be looking at least some of the parts of Western ideology. We'll get more into Western ideology in Unit 5, especially when we get to our Enlightenment thinkers. But for today, we're going to be looking at Europe, and we're going to see how Europe changes between the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 and all the way up to our time period, which is actually 1200 to 1450. So I will have to reach back quite a ways in order to fully explain how Europe came to be. But it shouldn't take too long, and we should be able to at least hit the major points pretty quickly before moving on to what we need to actually get to. We're going to skip the reading here. Let's go ahead and look at our essential questions. They're the same as before. What factors contributed to the formation and expansion of nations? What method do states and governments use to centralize their power? And how does the development of culture create long term impacts? We should be able to explain the beliefs and practices of religion in Europe and not only explain and identify them, but also show their effects. And then we should also explain the causes and then the consequences of political decentralization. So that should give you a hint that Europe is going to be a bit decentralized, at least until the end of our lecture. We'll see at the end of our lecture, Europe starts to centralize, and then we'll see even more centralization occur in Unit 3. By the end of this, you should be able to write context and thesis. We will be going over those in our synchronous sessions, so we won't go over those right away, or at least right now, but realize that we're going to be focusing on context and thesis with this lesson. Let's go ahead and look at the quote of the day. Now, the first thing I want you to notice about the quote of the day is that it comes from Eugene V. Debs, who's around in the 1900s. And it seems like a very odd quote to use, considering that we are discussing a time that takes place between 1200 and 1450. But I'll explain why I use this quote in just a second. It says, I am opposing a social order in which it is possible for one man who does absolutely nothing that is useful to amass a fortune, while millions of men and women who work all the days of their lives secure barely enough food for a wretched existence. We see that Eugene V. Debs was looking at American society in the early 1900s, and we'll talk more about that society once we get to Unit 5. But this same quote could be applicable to the feudal society that we are going to see in Europe today. When we get to Unit 5, we'll be looking at Karl Marx, and he'll write his book, The Communist Manifesto. And this will jumpstart the socialist and communist movement, not only in the United States, but in Europe as well. And then obviously eventually into China, as we'll get to in Unit 8. And we'll see that Karl Marx draws upon the history of this particular time period, starting with the feudal ages in Europe, in order to make the argument that Eugene V. Debs is making, that society is structured in such a way that the people who do nothing make a fortune, and the people who work a whole lot out in the fields or in the factories make barely enough to survive. And we'll talk more about communism and capitalism in a little bit as well. But I do want to use this quote in order to show you the connections between each of the units that we're going over. So when I get to Unit 5, I will call back to Unit 1 and I will say, hey, remember when we talked about feudalism back in Unit 1? So here's all the things in Unit 5. So I want you to see those connections there. Let's go ahead and move on there. All right, before we get into our study of Europe and the government, we need to look at its culture. And so the two major religions that are going to be prevalent in Europe are Judaism and Christianity. We'll start with Judaism. It is one of the oldest religions, even a little bit older than Hinduism, being founded in 2000 BCE, with Abraham as being the father of the Jewish faith. And we have the symbol as the Star of David. I'm sure that you guys know about that as well. But what I want to look at is the beliefs. One, it's monotheistic, which makes it different than Hinduism, at least some forms of Hinduism that are polytheistic. But secondly, what I want to look at is that there's this belief that Israel, and specifically the city of Jerusalem, is the holy land of the Jews. Now, the Jews were sent out and dispersed from their homeland multiple times throughout their history. They were dispersed by the Babylonian exile under Nebuchadnezzar II in like 587 BCE. I might be wrong on that date there, but somewhere about 600 BCE, and then returned in 530 BCE. But then were expelled again by the Roman Empire in the year 70 AD, or so, I'm sorry, 70 CE, 70 of the Common Era. They were expelled once again from Jerusalem. So when we get to Unit 7, and hopefully we are all back in this wonderful classroom that I have set up right here, we are going to be studying World War I, which I realize is a massive jump between what I just said. I realize I'm jumping from 70 AD all the way up to the 1900s there, but we see that culture has a massive impact over a long period of time. And we will be talking, we'll have our Treaty of Versailles simulation where I'm not going to lecture, we're all going to sit in a group and we're going to discuss how the world should be run in the post-World War I world. And one delegation will be representative of the Jewish population, or the Zionists is actually what I'm going to call them, who are people who want a Jewish homeland in the Middle East. And I'm going to ask, would the Jews want a homeland in the Middle East? And there's going to be some smart person in the back of class who raises their hand and goes, me, calling me, Mr. Cernan, Mr. Cernan. And I'm going to call on them and I'm going to ask, why would Jews in Europe want a home in the Middle East? And they would say, well, because Jews were removed from their homeland multiple times thousands of years ago. And that would be the correct answer. We call Jews being kicked out of their homeland a diaspora. It's a dispersion of people from their homeland. So in essence, Jews were in Israel, and for the multiple reasons that I described, were kicked out of Israel and settled all across the world, mainly in the Middle East, and then mainly in Europe. And then once the United States was discovered, they came over to America as well. This is very similar to other diasporas. One diaspora that we'll be going over is of the African population due to slavery. We'll see that people of African descent are not only in Africa, but also in the United States, and especially in South America. There are many people there of African descent, or at least partially of African descent. So we call that a diaspora of African peoples as well. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about the slave trade. Another diaspora that's really occurring right now is the refugee crisis that's happening. Because of all of the violence and chaos that's in the Middle East, many of the people from the Middle East are going east to China or going west to Europe. And so that would be a diaspora, as well as they are leaving their families and going to many places all around the world. So we'll see multiple examples of diasporas throughout human history. The Jews happen to just be the most famous of the diasporas. Let's go ahead and move on to the other major religion, which is Christianity. So the founder was Jesus Christ in 33 CE. That is when he was crucified on the cross, as we see right here. We use Jesus's birth as year zero. So anything that happened before Jesus's birth is BCE, before Common Era. Anything after, we used to call it AD, which is Latin. It's Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord. But then Europeans found out that not every single person is Christian. So we, as historians, decided that using the Christian language and using Latin probably isn't great for every other person in the world. So we started using CE, or Common Era. So that's what this is right here. And we have our beliefs here, but there's two that I want to point out. One, Christianity also thinks that Jerusalem is a very holy city for them, because Jesus was crucified just outside of Jerusalem. Now, if you're a smart student here and you remember our study of Islam, I also mentioned that it is believed by Muslims that Muhammad rose from Jerusalem into the heavens to speak with Allah before coming back down to earth. So Jerusalem is also very important to the Muslims. You can start to see how this is going to be a problem later, much later, as we talk in Unit 8 about this at the very end of the year. But we can already see that when you have three different religions all claiming the same city as their own city and all having very legitimate claims from their very legitimate holy books like the Torah or the Bible or the Quran, yeah, that's going to cause issues, but we'll talk about those issues later. The second thing I want to talk about is that Christianity spread rapidly throughout Europe because of the Roman Empire. There it is. I'm sorry that was blocking it there. Specifically, the roads. The Romans had great roads, and so people could travel and trade very quickly and very easily. And we've already talked about with travel and trade. We already saw that Islam travels very well because those Islamic traders traveled because of trade or traveled because they were making a pilgrimage. They took Islam with them. The same thing can be said about Christianity because it could be spread so easily because of those roads. It spread very widely to take over all of Europe. And if I said this in class and I asked, hey, is there another type of society or another society we've gone over that use roads to its advantage? One kid, that same kid maybe from before would be in the back and go, oh, Mr. Cernak, Mr. Cernak, right here. I know it. I know it. And I would call on them. I'd say, yes, go ahead. And they would say, the Inca had roads. We studied that last class. The Inca had a great road system, and then that allowed them to travel and trade and collect taxes and do all these wonderful things. And I would say, you are absolutely correct. Way to remember that. So that is Christianity. Christianity in society, though, when we talked about the Abbasid Caliphate, we said the Abbasid Caliphate was fairly tolerant of other religions. You could be Jewish, you could be Christian, you didn't have to be Muslim, as long as you paid a tax. Yeah, that doesn't exist in Europe. Every single person is going to be in the Catholic Church. There's not going to be any Hindus. There's not going to be any Muslims there. Europe is going to be a very Christian Catholic part of the world. And what we're going to see is that the church is going to have all of the power. And we'll talk about the power of the church and what they do with that power a little bit later, and even in our next lecture when we get onto the Crusades. Let's talk about the city-states here. First off, this is an example of decentralization. So after the fall of the Roman Empire in 476, all of Europe is divided into small countries. No longer do you have this massive Roman Empire that's controlling everyone. It's all broken up. And you hopefully studied that in 8th grade when you looked at ancient history. If we look at Italy right here, so we know the country of Italy. I mean, if you've looked at a map before, Italy, it's the boot, it's kicking the rock right there. All of this is unified today. But that was not the case in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, year 1000 right here, we see that it's broken up into all of these little decentralized kingdoms. This is similar to the Maya. If you remember the Maya, they had decentralized city states where each little individual area kind of did its own thing. And that's what you have here in Italy and throughout the entirety of Europe. We can imagine that this is going to have consequences. We said that centralization caused new technology to form in the Song Dynasty. We said it caused new trade routes when we looked at the Abbasid Caliphate. And we said that both of those were really good things because they brought knowledge and technology and wealth to a society. And we can imagine that the opposite is true. That in a decentralized society, they're not going to trade as much, they're not going to have as much knowledge, and they're not going to have as much technology. If you're a good student, you should be, comparing China and Dar al-Islam to the decentralized societies within Europe. For example, what I would do in class is I would say, hey, how is Europe similar or different than China and Dar al-Islam? And there would be that one kid, it's the same kid from the last two examples, who would be at the back of class and go, Mr. Cernak, Mr. Cernak, I know, call on me, call on me. And I would stand there at the front of class knowing that this student has already answered multiple questions in a row. And I would just look around and I would wait and I would say, does anyone else want to answer the question? And all of you, the rest of the class would just kind of blankly stare at me and just kind of shake your head, like, yeah, not really. And you would try to like avoid eye contact with me. You try to like look down and like pretend that, because you can't see me, I can't see you. And the kid in the back would still be raising it. It's like, oh, 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 oh. But their arm would start to get tired. So they always get this arm up there, like, oh, mister, mister. And then start banging on the table and try to get me to pay attention to them. And so finally, I would just give up and say, go ahead. Just tell us everything you know. You know what? I'll go sit at my desk. You can teach the class. And the kid would say, well, actually, China and the Abbasid Caliphate are significantly different than Europe because Europe was highly, highly decentralized, while China and the Abbasid Caliphate were highly centralized. And this has profound effects on both societies. And they would be correct. And so you should start to see the differences in centralization between Europe and China and Dar al Islam. But beyond just seeing the similarities, also understanding the effects of those choices that were made. What are the effects of decentralization on a society? What are the effects of centralization on a society? And that's what we want to be looking at today. We've already looked at centralization and multiple examples of it. Let's look at decentralization. The first thing we want to go over with government is feudalism. I have this great activity for feudalism. It is a perfect activity. Everyone loves it. I love it. You love it. Everyone loves it because what happens is everyone gets a starburst, at least one starburst by the end of class. And it's wonderful. So every single year I go to the store and I go, I don't know, maybe the Smiths or maybe the local gas station, and I go and I buy all of their starbursts. Like I'm not using that as like an expression to mean like a lot of starbursts. Like I get every single starburst they have in the store. And I take these bags of Starburst, like that's my weight training for the day because it's so heavy. I plop them on the cash register, and the guy just looks at me, and he looks at me, looks at the Starburst, looks at me, looks at the Starburst, and looks at me. He's like, "Sir, is everything okay? Like, are you going through like a little bit of a crisis or something? Like, you like notice that you're getting a little bald spot up here. Like, is everything okay at home?" And I tell him like, look, I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm a teacher. I'm a high school history teacher, and I'm teaching feudalism. And every year I do this, the cashier immediately knows what I'm talking about. They're like, oh, that's how I learned feudalism. So for whatever reason, the American public school system, we learned feudalism by giving out starbursts. It's a ritual that everyone else has already gone through in the United States. And so we would go through it as well, except that you are unfortunately not in the classroom and I'm just sitting here talking to myself, I guess, which is a bit depressing. But we got to do what we got to do because one day you will be back in this classroom and things are going to be wonderful. So I will explain feudalism the best I can without starburst. It's a fairly easy system to understand. The king is up at the top, and the king has everything. The king has land, the king has wealth, the king has money, the king has power. And what the king does is he doesn't want to work. I mean, after all, he's king. I mean, his hands are not getting dirty. Okay, these aren't like calloused hands who have worked hard their whole life, and he's going to get down there in the dirt and start planting. No, he's the king. Okay, and this is where we start to see Eugene V. Debs' quote, the quote of the day, start to come into play at least a little bit. So he is going to hire a lord, and he's going to say, you Lord, you're going to run the land for me. You're going to I'll give you this little bit of land, which is how you get wealth and how you get power, and you're just going to do everything for me. Well, the Lord's not going to work the land either. So the Lord is going to hire a bunch of serfs. These are peasants, and we're going to talk about them in more detail in just a little bit, but they make up 90% of the population. These are the people who are going to work the land, and they will give the any food or any resources that they produce, they're going to give it to the Lord. But if you'll remember, and I'll jump back to the map really quick, you have all these small, little, tiny societies right here. Okay? All of these tiny societies, they want to fight one another. After all, this isn't the Pax Mongolica or the Pax Romana. And we'll talk about what that is in Unit 2 where you have a highly centralized and very large society, and because everyone's in the same society, they're all at peace. Yeah, this is the opposite of that. You have a bunch of people who are different from one another sitting right next to one another. So there's going to be a lot of conflict. You, as a lord, have to find a way to protect that land And so you're going to hire knights, and these knights are going to protect the land, protect the serfs, pretty much protect the wealth that the Lord has. Above everyone, and not pictured here, is the Roman Catholic Church. And we'll talk about who that or what their power is in just a little bit. What I want you to see and what the major difference is between this type of society and the centralized society of the song, it has to do with contractual agreements. And let me see if I can explain it, at least to the best of my ability. And if we don't fully understand it right now, we'll talk about it more in our synchronous sessions. So if you think back to the Song Dynasty, we looked at the fact that their society is based on Confucian classics, the Confucian idea of filial piety. And so there's a bit of societal pressure put upon you to follow the rules of the government. So if the government says, hey, this is what we're going to do, you're just going to do it and you're not going to question it at all. That's not quite the same thing, and as we see in feudalism here. If a lord says to a serf, hey, you need to do this, the serfs still have to do it, but it's not because of social pressure or Confucian classics or anything like that. It much more has to do with contracts. After all, it's the same day I did my Southeast Asia lecture, and we were talking about McDonald's. So we'll talk about McDonald's again. If you work at McDonald's, yes, you are, the cashier. You're kind of the low man on the totem pole. You don't really have much power, but you're not there because someone told you you had to be there. It's not because the government said you better start working at McDonald's because I told you to, and because you believe in filial piety. No, it's much more of a contractual obligation. You work at McDonald's in a cashier position because you want to make a little bit of money. The Lord or the manager of McDonald's wants to hire you because they need someone to work the cash register. And so you come to an agreement. I will work for you if you pay me minimum wage or $8 or $9 or whatever it is they're paying at McDonald's nowadays. So what we see is that this society is based much more on contracts between the classes instead of the government simply telling people what to do. And I know that seems like a very small, minute difference, but it has profound consequences over time. And we'll talk about it a little bit more when we look at serfs, and especially when we look at the Magna Carta in just a little bit. We'll see why that idea of a social contract is so important. Let's talk about serfs. So serfs lived in these small towns called manors. Here's the manor. Here's where the serfs are going to work. This is 90% of the population, and they have absolutely no education because, well, first of all, they can't afford to go to school. Second of all, what's the point? I mean, what is the point of going to school if your entire day is going to be farming? Like, you don't need to know how to read a book if you're going to be outside farming and taking care of animals all day. So there's absolutely no point. There's also this prevailing opinion that if you are born as a serf, that you're kind of just supposed to be born that way. You're kind of supposed to know your place. And so there's no point in educating you, simply because if you're born as a serf, you have a serf's education already. And I know that's something that's difficult for us to wrap our minds around because we're so used to the idea that you can go to school and you can learn and you can make yourself better. That's just been ingrained in our society. But that wasn't the way that people looked at the world in Europe during this particular time period. It was, you're a serf, you have all the knowledge that you're ever going to have when you're born, and you're just never going to be smart enough to ever be king or a lord or anything like that. So we still have this very rigid social structure here. I don't want you to think it was some fluid social structure that was easy to move up. No, it's still very, very rigid. Now, this is an example of the environment here. So we've seen a couple examples of human beings interacting with their environment, but what we see is that we have the first field. I think the second field is behind my video right here, and then the third field right here. And what the serfs are going to use is that they're going to use crop rotation. Now, let me give you a very limited discussion about farming because I'm not a farmer. You could tell that by looking at me. And I'll at least try to explain a little bit as to what's going on with my very limited knowledge. You could take this field here and you could grow corn on it, let's say. And after you grow that corn, you could harvest all that corn, and then you could say, well, I guess I'll grow some more corn. And so you could put some more corn down, you would grow some corn, you would harvest it. And then you say, oh, I harvested some corn, I'll just put some more corn down, repeat until you die. That is not good for the soil. And for those of you who are science people or farming people, you could probably explain this better than I can. But that robs the soil of its nutrients. It takes the nutrients out of the soil, and then the soil is left dry. It's, I believe the term is fallow, and it's just not good soil. You're not going to be able to grow anything else on it. But if you rotated crops, you could avoid depleting the soil of its nutrients. So you could grow corn, you could harvest that corn. And then once you've harvested that corn, you could, instead of planting more corn, you could say, you know what? I'm going to plant some potatoes. And so potatoes would be planted there. Potatoes are going to replenish the nitrates that are in the soil and the nutrients that are in the soil. And then once you harvest those potatoes, you might say, you know what, I'll grow some squash. And some squash are going to also replace some of the nutrients that are there. And once you're done with squash, well, then you go back to growing corn. You rotate through the crops. So the first field might be corn, the second might be potatoes, and the third might be squash. And then you rotate through them. So this is an example of human beings interacting with their environment or working with their environment in order to make more efficient farming. The last thing I want to talk about with this slide is, please go away. Go away so that way the kids can see it. There you go. Coercive labor. This is another one of the words that the AP people like to use. They like to throw in coercive labor. They will say, explain the different types of coercive labor systems. And what they want, because they are evil, maybe not all of them, but sometimes they seem like they're pretty evil. What they want the people to do, what they want students taking the test to do, is to look at the word coercive and go, I don't know what the word coercive means. I've never seen that word before. That's a big word. I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing coercive correctly. I don't know anything about coercive labor systems. I don't know what to do. And then you fail the test. Coercive labor systems is just forcing someone to work. Slavery would be an example of a coercive labor system. Slavery is more of a forced labor system because you don't have a choice. If you are a slave, your choices are work or be killed for not working. So that's, I mean, it's a type of coercive labor. It's a type of extreme coercive labor. Coercive labor is more of the type of labor in which you are forced to work, not because someone's holding a weapon to your head, but just because of the structure within the society. Let me give you an example. Let me give you a modern day example, and I should be able to explain what coercive labor is. So when I was growing up, I had a friend of mine. I think we were like 10 or 11 years old at the time, and he did not have a good relationship with his father. He was very, very mad at him all the time. And he would constantly, this kid would constantly tell me, because I was his buddy back in the day, he would say, man, I'm leaving. I'm going to leave. I'm just going to walk out the home. I'm just going to do my own thing. I'm going to leave. I'm never coming back. I'm never going to be with him, man. Da 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 da. Whatever. Okay. So one night, he's home. His dad is there, and he's just mad. The kid is just so upset. I forgot what happened, but he goes to his dad, who is sitting in the kitchen. He says, Dad, that's it. I'm leaving. I'm sick of you. I'm sick of living here. I hate it here. I'm walking out that door. And you would expect the dad to do something about this. You would expect the father to say something like, "Oh no, son, please, 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 let's talk about this. Let's smooth things over. Tell me what's going on." No, this guy took a different approach. He said, "All right, go ahead, go ahead. Door's right there. You know how to open doors. You turn the handle, just walk out." And the kid just kind of stared at him, like, because he didn't expect to get that far. He didn't expect the dad to just kind of let him go. And so the kid just said, yeah, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to walk out. And the dad says, okay, yeah, that's fine. But let me remind you of a couple things. You have absolutely no money. Okay, you have nothing. So not really sure how you're going to pay for food. Secondly, you're like 11 years old. So you're not getting a job. Third, you don't have a roof over your head. I pay for this. I pay for this house. I pay for that television in our living room over there. All right. So you're not going to be able to pay for those things. So yeah, if you want to go live on the street and you want to go like starve yourself, yeah, go right ahead. And as you could imagine, the kid walked right back to his room and just sat there because he knew that he could not leave. He knew that he did not have the money, he did not have the strength, he did not have the resources to survive on his own. That's exactly how the serfs feel about the lords. The lords say, "Look, you can walk right off. You can go ahead. Go be free. What are you going to do? You don't have food. You don't have land. You don't have resources. You don't have protection. You have absolutely nothing. I provide all of those things for you." And that's why so many serfs are going to stay on the land. They are coerced. That's where this word it comes from. Coercive labor, coerced labor, because yeah, they're not forced to. They don't have a weapon to their head, but they can't actually ever get out of labor because of the system that they're in. We're going to see this after the end of slavery with indentured servitude as well, which isn't forced but is coerced labor. But you can also see with this coercive labor this form of a contract here that serfs are saying, I will work for you. I will give you my labor as long as you provide me with food and protection. Even if it's only a little tiny bit of food, barely enough to survive, that is still, at least in the eyes of the serf, better than having absolutely nothing at all. So it's important to remember coercive labor, and it's important to remember that this social structure is based much more on contractual agreements, even if it's just verbal contracts, those contractual agreements, as opposed to societal pressures coming down from the government or coming from sort of religious background there. Knights, we know about Knights. We're home of the Las Vegas Golden Knights. So we know about Knights. They have that code of chivalry. They're there to protect the land, protect the lords, protect the serfs. I mean, that is, once again, that is their job. The Lord, via this verbal contract, gives them a nice home and allows them to train as knights. In return, whenever the Lord goes to war, the knights are going to fight for them. So it's a contract. There's a little bit of give and a little bit of take. Women during this time were seen as they had to be protected because they themselves were not able to protect themselves. They were weak and dainty. So you had to have the chivalrous knight ride into battle in order to save the damsel in distress. I wish I could give you a really cool knight movie like King Arthur or something, but I feel that more people are familiar with Shrek. So Shrek, when he saves Fiona from the castle, that's kind of what a knight does. Um, we can compare this with China and Dar al-Islam, that women are seen as important, which is different than what we've seen in China or the Song Dynasty and Dar al-Islam, but they're still seen as inferior, as unable to do things for themselves. And so the men have to step in and do everything. Our last part here before we get to the church is the lords and kings. What I want you to see here is that this is the king right here, and all of the lords, this is a priest here, lords are standing around him and watching him sign this contract, which hits home the idea that I've been talking about society being based on contractual relations as opposed to societal pressures. Lords often challenge the power of the kings because the lords could say, King, we had an agreement. Maybe it's just a verbal agreement, but we did have an agreement and you're not upholding your end of the agreement. So we're going to use force and we're going to use our power in order to ensure that you're following your end of the agreement. Otherwise, we'll take our armies and we'll attack you. And the king legitimately had to worry about this. He legitimately had to worry about lords coming together in order to fight him. Because if all of these guys take their knights and their armies and combine them together, they're going to be able to defeat the king. And so it was very important for the king to make sure that the lords were happy. This is an example of decentralized government. Instead of this guy saying, this is what we are going to do because I decreed it, it's these individuals saying, here's what we collectively want to do. And there are advantages and disadvantages to this type of government. And we'll discuss those advantages and disadvantages a little bit later once we get into Unit 4, where we see more examples of decentralized government. But know that this idea of decentralized government, this idea of social contract, this idea of the people challenging the power is prevalent fairly early in European history and is going to have long-term consequences as we continue our study of history. Up at the very top is the church. Everyone must follow the church. If you're a king, if you're a lord, you're a knight, you're a serf, everyone's got to follow the church. Church is the number one authority. What is the church's power? And the church has a few different types of power. The major one being the excommunication power. They can take away your afterlife. If you do not obey the power of the church can say, that's it. You are never allowed in church again. And you can't receive communion. And if you cannot receive communion, you cannot get into heaven. They just damned you to hell for all of eternity. That is incredibly frightening if you are a person in Europe during this particular time period. So when the church says, shut up and listen to us, you better shut your mouth and you better listen to them, because the consequences are dire if you do not. Here is a picture of my picture, actually. I had a chance to go to Paris. This is Notre Dame. So this is a massive church in Paris, and I'll show you a couple other pictures in just a second. We said that architecture was a way to show power. We saw that with the Grand Palace at Tikal. We saw it with Machu Picchu as well in the Incan Empire. Well, it's the same thing here. The church is showcasing how powerful they are. This is a massive structure, the Church of Notre Dame. These are both of my pictures as well. I went on an early morning run and got to take pictures around Notre Dame. So this is the other side. So here's the back side, there's the front side, or maybe that's the back side and this is front side. No one can be really sure. But then here's definitely the inside. I'm sure that this is the inside of, and you can see how massive and huge it is. It's just to showcase the power of the church. These are not my pictures. This is a picture of St. Peter's Basilica that was built a little bit later. We're talking 1500s and 1600s, but still it does a good job at showcasing the power of the church. What we're going to see in our next lecture, which is on the Crusades, is that the church, in addition to having monetary and spiritual power, so they have a whole lot of money and they have spiritual power, they have religious power over the people, they also have the power to organize people. And being able to organize a large group of people in order to have them all go do the same thing, or at least work together to accomplish some goal, is a very good example of power. And it's very difficult to have. The Catholic Church, now I'm going to say it, I'm going to be the first person to say it, and I might sound stupid for it, but I don't care. I'm saying it, I'm sticking by it. The church is the DJ Khaled of the Middle Ages. Here's why. DJ Khaled has the power to organize people. No, he doesn't actually do anything. He doesn't produce anymore. He doesn't rap. He just kind of gets on the track and says, like, we the best, or another one. That's it. That's all he does. But his power lies in the fact that he can get Justin Bieber and Lil Wayne and Rihanna and Chance the Rapper and a bunch of other rappers who I don't know because I'm really out of touch with pop culture. You can get them all in the same room and get them all on a song together. That's what the church can do as well. And we're going to see that with the Crusades. They can organize people. Those little small decentralized societies in Europe, they're not organizing anyone. Maybe they could organize people within their own realm, but that's it. They're not organizing large groups of people. The church can say, hey, we're all going out, we're going on a crusade. And the people are going to say, okay, absolutely, I'm in. And they're not even going to question it. That's the power that the church has. But as I said, we'll discuss that more when we get to the Crusades. We also see, and I briefly mentioned this, is that the church has a lot of monetary power. So people are to pay a tithe to the church, which is a mandatory donation, which is an oxymoron. If it's mandatory, it's not really a donation. So maybe I should change that, but whatever. Mandatory donation to the church. We're going to see in Unit 3 that Martin Luther is going to challenge the power of the church, and specifically challenge the power of indulgences in which people had to give money to the church. We'll talk more about that then. Be aware that the church is highly powerful and very centralized and really acts as a centralized government, similar to the Song dynasty, similar to the Abbasid Caliphate. and while simultaneously the actual temporal powers of Europe, so not spiritual powers, but like the governments are fairly weak and decentralized. All of that is going to change in just a little bit once we are done talking about Russia. We have to mention Russia very, very briefly. So while the rest of Europe is Catholic, at least during this time period, we're going to see that changes a little bit later. Russia is going to be Eastern Orthodox after the year 1054. There was a split in the Catholic Church between East and West. That's really all you need to know. And the West Europe went Catholic, East Europe, mainly Russia, went to the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now in Western Europe, the Pope is the spiritual leader, so he has a whole lot of power. And then there are governmental leaders, so like kings and queens of those particular small countries in Europe. In Russia, the spiritual leader and the worldly leader, or like the king, are the same exact person. It's going to be the czar. So when we get to Unit 7 and we're talking about Tsar Nicholas II, and we say he's powerful because he's a king, he's even more powerful than other kings because he is almost quite literally God on earth, at least in the eyes of the Russians. So know that what you need to get from this slide is that Russia is Eastern Orthodox. They're Christian, but it's a different type of Christian than the rest of Western Europe. Let's go ahead and move on to the later Middle Ages here. During the later Middle Ages, we start to see a little more centralization occur. Not everywhere, not in the Holy Roman Empire. We'll talk about that in just a second here. But in places like England and France, more centralization starts to occur. And we'll talk more and more about this centralization when we get to Unit 3 as well. So in France, you start to see King Philip IV starts to collect more and more power, and it forms the Estates General, which we will talk about again in 1789 when we talk about the French Revolution in period 5. The Holy Roman Empire is under Otto the First. When I say Holy Roman Empire, I'm talking about modern day Germany, and we'll talk about why it's called the Holy Roman Empire a little bit later when we talk about the history of Germany. This eventually turns into a collection of small decentralized societies. So where Germany is now used to be a bunch of small little societies who kind of did their own thing, but they all spoke the Germanic language and they all kind of had Germanic customs. And we're going to talk about how eventually all of those small decentralized societies come together, but that won't be until Unit 6 because that's going to be in the 1870s. Norman England, you have the Battle of Hastings in 1066. All that matters here for us is that England is invaded by France. And this will be the last time that England has ever been invaded, at least a land invasion through the English Channel. And we will see that because the French win, the English will be more like the French and less like Scandinavia. I know to you guys that probably doesn't really mean that much because you would have to have a very good understanding of both French and Scandinavian politics, but know that England and France are going to be highly centralized. Both of those areas are going to be very, very centralized. They're going to start to copy the ways of the Chinese, not entirely. They're going to be more centralized, but that doesn't mean they're going to be identical. And the way that they are not identical, and the piece of evidence to prove that they're not identical, is the Magna Carta. So as we saw a few slides ago, right here, the Lords challenge the power of the king, challenge him to sign a document. Same thing with the Magna Carta right here. The nobles challenge the power of King John, and they say, look, your power needs to be limited. You cannot have unlimited power. You can't just do whatever you want. There are certain freedoms that every person, or at least the nobles, should have and should be protected by the government. The right to a trial by jury. You have to consult us on taxes. You, the king, have to actually obey the law as well. You can't just do whatever you want. To us, this might not mean much. To us, we say, well, great, some guys in some crowns and some fancy robes signed a piece of paper in like 1,000 years ago. Why should I care? The reason you should care is because this is the beginning of the type of government that we have today. This idea that you could challenge the power of the king. That doesn't exist in the other societies we've gone over. You can't challenge the power of the Abbasid Caliphate. That's illegal to do so. You can't challenge the power of the Song Dynasty. That's illegal to do so. But here in Europe, in these what is starting to become a more centralized society, you can challenge the power of the king or of the leaders. And we'll see this come back again in Unit 5. When we look at the American Revolution and the French Revolution, we'll see that those people are going to challenge the power of their leaders because they feel justified in doing so because of the contracts. Remember, this all comes back to this idea of verbal contracts. Because you as a king are supposed to provide for me as as your subject. If you do not provide for me, I have a justification and a right to attack you. That is a very important idea. I know it's something that just seems kind of simple and easy to kind of shrug off, but it is incredibly important. And we'll see that plays an even larger role down the road in the 1700s and 1800s. Last thing we'll talk about is the Hundred Years' War, because I know this lecture is getting on a little bit long, and I know it's not the most exciting of lectures because it's European history, and thank goodness this isn't AP Euro because that would be far too confusing. You would have to memorize all these names. Everyone is named Henry or Frederick or Ferdinand. All the kings in France are Louis. Makes it incredibly confusing. So I'm glad that we can kind of touch and go with Europe here. Let's talk about the Hundred-Year War. This is England versus France. There's a succession crisis. So I believe it is the King of France dies, and there are people in England who say, well, wait a second, my lineage goes all the way to this guy, so I should be the one to take the throne. And there's people in France who say, well, my lineage goes all the way up, and I should be the one to take the throne. I'm not going to get into the lineages. It's long, it's boring, it's incredibly confusing, and unnecessary for us. So what we see is that England and France are going to fight for actually over 100 years. But there's two major battles, especially closer to the end. One is going to be the Battle of Agincourt. At this battle, King Henry V, the King of England, unites his troops together. And this isn't a king who's kind of standing away from the battlefield and telling his serfs, like, go fight for me, go win a battle. No, he's on the front line with them. And this is actually most evidently seen in Shakespeare's play, Henry V, in which Kenneth Branagh, who's playing Henry V, rallies the troops together, gives a wonderful speech. Christian Bale, who plays Batman, is there. He's an actor there as well. Great play, great movie as well. And he rallies the troops and wins a major battle at the Battle of Agincourt. And it looks like that it's going to turn the tide in the favor of England, and England's going to be powerful and strong. But 14 years later, the Battle of Orleans occurs. And this is where you get the famous Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc, you have to remember, she's a woman. She's a girl. In fact, at the beginning of this story, she's like 13 years old. Yes, she's 13 years old. So you can imagine that most of the men who are fighting aren't really taking her seriously. That is until she shows that she should be taken seriously. So when she's 13, she receives a vision from the angels and saints saying that she needs to be the one to lead the French forces and she will be the one to lead them to victory. She tells this to the French military commander, who kind of laughs at her and says, what are you joking? Like, you're a 13-year-old girl, you're gonna lead the troops." But years later, by the time she's about 17 or 18 years old, for whatever reason, he comes around. He sees that he's getting kicked around by the English, and he says, you know what? Can't get any worse. Might as well let this girl do it, see what happens. And so Joan of Arc eventually leads the troops. Now, I don't want you to think that Joan of Arc is like having a sword in her hand and she's slicing people. No, what she's doing is she's offering advice to the military commanders, and she's carrying the flag into battle. So she's got the flag and she's riding it in front of the soldiers into battle. And for whatever reason, maybe it's divine intervention, maybe it's just luck, coincidence, who knows? The French win. The French win a huge battle at the Battle of Orleans, and this really turns the tide in the favor of the French. And so the French will eventually win the Hundreds-Year War. Now, is it important that we know every little detail about Joan of Arc's life? No. Is it important that we know that Kenneth Branagh played Henry V in the William Shakespeare play? Now, what is important are the results. Number one, England loses land in France, and so France and England remain separate. The way that England looked after the Hundred Years' War is pretty much how it looks now. The way that France looked after the war is pretty much the way it looks now. We're going to see that France's borders change a little bit because of their issues and conflicts with Germany. But we also see a couple other things that are more difficult to pinpoint. I mean, it's easy to pinpoint winners and losers and who gets what land, but it's harder to pinpoint the changes in culture that occur because usually it's not something that happens immediately, but something that happens over a long period of time. So the first one I want to go over that actually isn't on here is this idea of fighting to the death for your country. This idea that it is honorable to be a man, to go into battle, to fight against the enemy, and possibly lose your life, and that you will receive honor and glory for all of eternity for having done so. I mean, that is what Henry V really digs into to his men in his men at the Battle of Agincourt, where he rallies them and says that it is honorable to die for your country, and we're going to remember you and offer a toast up to you, and all of these wonderful things. We're going to see that in World War One, this idea still persists. That this idea of you have to go fight for your country because it's the honorable and right thing to do is what pushes many young men into World War One. But after the horrors of World War One, this idea of war being this honorable thing completely changes. And we'll discuss that more in Unit 7. Our second thing is that armies became used for fighting a monarch. This starts to centralize rule. So we talked about centralizing rule by giving people a commonality, giving people a common language, giving people a common religion, but sometimes giving people a common enemy unites people together. Here at Rancho High School, we're all disparate, separate students. We're all individuals. We come from different walks of life. But when our football team goes out there and plays against Coronado, we all identify as Rancho Rams because we are against the Coronado Cougars, or yeah, they're Cougars. We're against them. So the idea of having a common enemy can centralize rule, but can also lead people to identify as English or French. We identify as Rancho Rams because we are against the Coronado Cougars. The English identify as English because we have similar language, similar custom, and we are against the French. So this idea of nationalism, this idea of centralizing rule based on a common enemy, that comes into play as well. And the last one is something we're going to talk a bit more in Unit 3, is the power of gunpowder. Before this, gunpowder, I mean, yeah, it existed in China and had existed for an incredibly long time, but it wasn't really used in warfare, at least not that often. When we get to Unit 3, we'll see how warfare changes because of gunpowder, and we'll see how societies and governments use gunpowder and these new advancements in military technology in order to centralize their rule. Ladies and gentlemen, that is going to finish up. That's it. That's going to finish up our lecture about the developments in Europe. Our next lecture, we're still going to focus on Europe. We're really going to focus on the power of the Catholic Church in the Crusades, and we're going to see this dynamic, this conflict, if you will, between the Christian European world and the more Arabic Muslim world. And we're going to see where that begins, and we're going to at least start to see how that is going to play a role throughout our entire study of history. Hope you guys enjoyed the lecture. If you missed anything, make sure you go back, rewind, make sure you get all the details as well. Make sure you understand what's going on. If you do have questions, please make sure you email me or drop a comment on Canvas or contact me in some way, shape, or form, and I will be more than happy to help.